I threw my 65th birthday party alone. No one came. But that night, a mute girl soaked in rain knocked on my shoe shop door, holding a crumpled note. Don't give me back to them. Her torn shoe unlocked a hell I never imagined. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss the spine-chilling stories we're about to reveal. Under the angry weight of a Louisiana sky, the rain fell like it was trying to erase something. Streets flooded in minutes. Gutters spat out leaves and wrappers, and the air held that heavy kind of silence that came before something broke open. In the heart of French Quarter, New Orleans, the kind of silence that knew secrets. Beneath the awning of an old, barely lit shoe store, Georgia's Souls, the lettering nearly worn off. A woman moved slowly behind the dusty display window. 70 years old, her back slightly hunched, but her hands steady. Georgia wiped down a scuffed pair of men's leather boots with a practiced rhythm. She didn't sell much anymore. Most of her customers were ghosts, and she had made peace with that. Rain tapped on the windows like fingers asking to be let in. A small radio whispered jazz from a corner shelf, grainy and cracked, as if coming from another time. The light inside was golden dim, the kind that made everything feel like it was slipping slowly backward. The smell of old leather wax and cedar oil filled the space. Her hands moved without thinking, first the heel, then the sole, then the polish repetition carved from decades of muscle memory. But her eyes kept wandering back to the framed photo on the counter. The glass was chipped at the corner, the photo inside faded to a soft sepia, a teenage girl with wild curls and laughter in her eyes. Underneath the faint handwriting, Melody, 1979. 40 years. 40 goddamn years. Georgia didn't need anniversaries to remember. Every day was a reminder. Her daughter had vanished walking home from the record store 3 blocks from here. Vanished into the wet air like a soul exhaled. No leads, no closure. Just absence sharp and endless. And still she kept this store open. Kept wiping shoes no one wore. Maybe because this was where she had last seen Melody laughing. Maybe because her grief needed somewhere to live. A sudden gust of wind rattled the front door. Georgia looked up, cloth still in her hand. At first, she saw nothing. Just the blur of rain. Then, movement. A small shadow curled under the overhang outside the shop, nearly hidden behind a stack of empty milk crates. Her eyes narrowed. The figure shifted again. A child, thin, drenched, barefoot or close to it, clothes clinging to her like they belonged to someone else. Georgia felt her chest tighten. She stepped closer to the window. The child stepped forward too slowly, cautiously, like an animal, unsure if it was about to be rescued or punished. Water dripped off her soaked hair, her shoulders, her fingertips. Georgia unlocked the door, her fingers trembling. It creaked open. The wind shoved past her, carrying the scent of the street rain, something metallic and something else, fear. The girl didn't speak, not a word. She simply held something out, a crumpled piece of paper shaking slightly in her pale fingers. Georgia took it. Her old eyes scanned the scrawled handwriting. The ink was smudged but still legible. Please don't give me back to them. Time slowed. Georgia looked up at the girl. The child looked maybe 7, maybe 9. It was hard to tell. Starvation and fear had a way of erasing the usual signs. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes hollow but pleading. Her silence wasn't shyness. It was something deeper, wounded. Georgia stepped aside without a word. The girl hesitated just a beat and then darted in like a bird too long in the cold. The door shut behind them. The rain hit harder now, as if angry it had lost something. Inside, Georgia turned up the heat, dimmed the radio, and guided the child to a wooden chair near the back. The girl sat, but didn't relax. Her hands clutched her knees. Her eyes kept darting toward the door. Georgia handed her a towel thick and faded with time. The girl didn't reach for it. "You can sit," Georgia said gently, voice like worn gravel. "No one's coming in here but ghosts, and they're all polite." Still no answer. Georgia leaned down slowly, placing the towel in the girl's lap. She noticed the girl's bare legs, bruised. purple and yellow marks that had no business being on a child. The girl's right foot wore a single battered shoe barely holding together, no laces. Her other foot was bare red from the cold. Something in Georgia cracked then and there, not loudly, not obviously, but deeply. She had seen those bruises before, long ago, on a girl's back. Her own daughter, before she vanished, had once come home from school with a similar purple shape blooming under her shirt. Georgia remembered confronting a teacher. The teacher had blamed a fall during recess. Maybe it was true, maybe not. But that bruise had haunted her because it had come just weeks before Melody disappeared. Georgia walked to the back room, came back with a dry sweatshirt and a pair of wool socks. "They're too big," she muttered. "But they're warm." She knelt again slowly, bones cracking in protest, slid the socks onto the girl's small feet. The girl flinched but didn't pull away. "Can you write your name?" Georgia asked, nodding at the notepad she kept by the register. The girl looked down at the towel in her lap. Slowly, mechanically, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a pen. The ink was smeared. Her hand trembled. She leaned forward, eyes locked on the paper, and wrote a single word, Eve. It was all she gave. Georgia sat across from her, letting silence do the rest. She didn't ask questions. She knew better. Sometimes the body shows you what words can't. Rain continued to hammer the roof like a slow drumbeat. Georgia stood and locked the front door, turned off the shop's open sign, drew the curtain across the front window. Then she lit the small ceramic stove in the corner and brewed a pot of chicory coffee. The smell filled the space like a warm blanket. She poured the girl a mug of hot milk, then settled back in her chair. Eve held the mug with both hands. Steam curled around her face. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes began to water. Not a sob, not a wail, just a silent, endless tremble. Her tears slid down her cheeks like they had waited too long to be allowed. Georgia watched her, watched the way her fingers trembled, watched the way her eyes kept drifting to the door, then the window, then back to Georgia. This girl wasn't running from a home. She was running from something far worse. Georgia reached over and gently placed her weathered hand on top of Eve's small, shaking one. "We don't give children back to wolves," she said simply. The rain eased a little, still steady but softer now. Eve looked up, and for the first time her eyes held something else. Recognition. Not trust, not yet, but the faint echo of it. Georgia exhaled deeply, as if letting go of air she didn't know she was holding. Her heart thudded once, then again. It felt old. It was old. But tonight, in the dim light of a forgotten shoe shop, something inside her stirred, something that hadn't stirred since 1979. Maybe it was madness, or maybe it was instinct. Either way, Georgia knew one thing with crystal clarity as she looked at the girl in front of her. She had come back. Not Melody. No, Melody was gone. But someone had come back to her, and this time she wasn't going to let the world take her. The silence in the shoe shop had changed. It was no longer the kind that spoke of forgotten time or old leather or the sound of raindrops ticking against a window. Now it was the silence of a fragile, unnamed thing breathing just beneath the surface, something waiting to be shattered by the world outside. The girl Eve sat curled on the old wooden chair, now dressed in a threadbare sweatshirt that swallowed her frame. Her knees were pulled to her chest, damp hair clinging to her cheeks, and though the storm outside had softened to a steady drizzle, the storm inside her had not moved at all. It clung to her like a shadow with claws. Georgia moved about the shop without words, as though afraid even the floorboards creaking might frighten the child. She warmed a cup of milk over the stovetop, added a sliver of cinnamon the way she used to for Melody, and brought it to Eve with both hands steady. "Here," she said softly, placing the cup on the small table beside her. "It'll help warm your belly." Eve didn't move. Georgia sat down opposite her, folding her hands over her knees. The space between them was thick with memory and hesitation. She tilted her head slightly. "Do you have a name, sweetheart?" she asked, the edge of southern drawl pressing gently against the question. No answer. Eve's eyes flicked up, then down again, her mouth firmly closed, as though something more than silence lived behind it, as if speaking was a luxury stolen from her long ago. Georgia leaned forward just a bit. "You don't have to talk. That's all right. But if you write it for me again, your name anything, I can help better. Still nothing. Only the slow rising steam from the mug, the rhythmic tapping of rain on glass, and the soft inhale of a child holding something in. Georgia sighed, stood up again, and grabbed the blanket draped over the armrest. She gently tucked it around Eve's shoulders. You're safe in here. You hear me? Her voice deepened. Ain't nobody gonna come through that door without going through me first. It was as she bent to check the girl's feet that she noticed it. The shoe, just one, not just tattered, but unfamiliar in shape, stitching, and sole, almost institutional, like something made for function, not comfort. Rough rubber outsole, no brand, no identifiable tags. Georgia had seen every kind of footwear in her long life, but this wasn't from any store in New Orleans. It wasn't from any place where children should be getting shoes. Her brows furrowed as she crouched beside the child's foot fingers, hovering but not touching. Where'd you get this, baby? She whispered half to herself. She could feel Eve tense, the way her body shrank back, the moment attention turned to that shoe. As if it held more than wear and tear, as if it held a story too dangerous to tell. Georgia rose slowly, her mind ticking, now layers unfolding. That shoe, just a shoe, and yet it was screaming. She didn't get time to finish the thought. 3 sharp knocks rattled the front door, their crisp echo slicing the air in two. Georgia froze. Eve jumped. Knock, knock, knock. Then a man's voice muffled through the door, but unmistakable in tone. Authority. Ma'am, New Orleans PD. Just need to ask a couple of questions. Eve bolted out of the chair like her body had been set on fire. The mug tipped over milk, spilling across the floor. She ran not toward the door, but away from it, scrambling behind the counter, crawling under the heavy oak table Georgia used for polishing boots. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her face into her arms, rocking slightly. Georgia blinked hard and turned toward the door, her own heartbeat beginning to thunder. Just a moment, she called out, her voice more solid than she expected. She walked to the door but didn't open it. She kept the latch locked and peered through the narrow glass slit. A young officer in a damp uniform stood there with his partner, both soaked from the rain. "Evening, ma'am," he said politely, trying a smile. "Sorry to trouble you. Your neighbor across the street said she saw a child come in here alone. Given the weather and, well, everything, we're just checking. Can we speak with her?" Georgia didn't answer immediately. Her hand stayed firm on the door. "She's asleep," she said finally, evenly. "Been crying for hours. Cold soaked through. You want to wake her up to ask her why she's out in the rain?" The younger cop shifted his weight. "Just standard procedure, ma'am. If she's lost or missing from somewhere, we just want to help." Georgia's jaw tightened. She stepped forward until her face nearly touched the glass. She didn't say a word. Not a single word. She handed me a piece of paper, and it said, "Not to give her back to them." No name, no shoes, covered in bruises. Covered. The cop blinked. "We're just trying to figure out who them is, ma'am." "So am I," she said. "But until I do, she stays with me." "Understood." His partner stepped forward. "Ma'am, we can't let you harbor a minor without information. There are protocols." "Then go get your protocol," she said, voice hardening, "and tell it to come back with a court order." Behind her, a quiet whimper echoed from under the table. Georgia's spine straightened, her shoulders squaring. The young cop hesitated. "All right," he said. "We'll file a report, but this won't be the end of it." She nodded. Didn't think it would be. The two men turned, stepping off the porch, radios crackling. Georgia waited until their silhouettes disappeared into the rain, then closed the curtain slowly. She turned back toward the room, her breath finally escaping in a long, rough exhale. Under the table, Eve was shaking, shoulders curled tight, face buried. Georgia crouched beside her again. Her bones screamed, but she ignored the pain. "Hey now," she said softly. "They're gone. Just me and you again, baby." Eve didn't look up. Georgia sat on the floor, back against the cabinet. For a while she said nothing, just listened to the girl's ragged, uneven breath. "My daughter," she said finally. "She was about your age when she disappeared, back in '79. I don't talk about it much. People stopped listening after the first 5 years. Hell, I stopped listening." The rain continued steady now, almost gentle. "They said she probably got snatched by someone passing through town, might have been taken out the state, might have never made it past the train station." She swallowed. But that feeling, that bone-deep certainty that she was still out there, that feeling never left. Eve still didn't respond, but her shaking had slowed. Georgia turned her head, voice steady. "I'm not going to give you back to anyone. You hear me? Not until I know for damn sure they aren't the ones that hurt you." A pause. Then slowly Eve peeked out from behind her arm. Just an eye. But it held something different this time. Recognition. And something else, a glimmer. Georgia nodded at her. "You don't have to speak, baby, but you don't gotta hide neither." She stood moving slowly, her knees cracking. "Come on out. I'll clean up the milk. You can help me pick out another pair of socks." Eve hesitated, then crawled out, still silent. She stood head bowed. Georgia didn't touch her, just turned toward the back, and the girl followed her like a shadow with no weight. As Georgia led her through the hallway toward the back room, she passed the photo of Melody again on the wall. She didn't stop this time, didn't flinch. Not because the pain was gone, but because tonight, for the first time in 4 decades, she had said no to losing a child, and meant it. The rain had finally thinned to a whisper. Outside, the streets of French Quarter still glistened wet, and the gutters hissed with runoff. But inside Georgia's shoe shop, the world had grown quiet again, except now that silence felt like a held breath. Georgia moved slowly, purposefully across the back room. The air was warm now from the ceramic stove, but the girl Eve, still curled into herself like warmth, was foreign, suspicious. She sat on a folded quilt near the old love seat Georgia had dragged out of storage, her knees drawn to her chest, a glass of water untouched beside her. Georgia returned from the bathroom with a bowl of warm water, a soft washcloth, and a small tin of salve she used on cracked leather one she'd once used on Melody's scraped knees when Band-Aids weren't enough. She knelt without a word. Her knees protested with the sound of age, but she ignored it. "Let me help," she said gently. "Just for tonight." Eve didn't move, but she didn't flinch either. That was permission enough. Georgia dipped the cloth into the water, wrung it out, then slowly reached for the girl's arm. As she rolled up the sleeve, her throat tightened. A faded bruise marked the skin above Eve's wrist, bluish-yellow now, but wide and deep. The shape wasn't from a fall. It was a grip. Finger marks. Someone had held her down hard. Georgia said nothing. She moved to the other arm. More bruises. Near the elbow, along the forearm. She kept her breath steady. Calm. Her voice light like wind chimes. "Ever try peanut brittle?" she asked, as though discussing candy, not trauma. "Too sweet for me. My daughter loved the stuff. Broke a tooth on it once, but still snuck it." No response. She continued cleaning quietly, moving to the girl's back. She lifted the edge of her shirt with great care. What she saw made her grip the cloth too tightly. Faint but unmistakable long linear bruises, like from a strap or belt. Old ones healing crooked. Some had barely scabbed over, the kind of wounds no child should carry. And still not a word from Eve. No flinch, no complaint. Just that silence sitting like a second skin on her. Georgia swallowed hard. She dipped her fingers into the tin and began applying the salve with care. The girl's skin twitched under her touch. Not in pain, but in reaction to unfamiliar kindness. "You don't have to tell me," Georgia murmured, "but I know hurt when I see it." Later, as Eve sipped warm tea, Georgia had swapped for the water. The old woman brought out a small sketch pad and a set of colored pencils she kept in the back drawer, leftovers from Melody's art days. "Want to draw?" The girl hesitated. Then slowly she reached out and took the pad. She flipped to the first page, chose the black pencil. Georgia busied herself polishing a boot across the room, but kept a careful eye. After a few minutes, Eve turned the pad around, sliding it slowly toward her. Georgia set down her cloth, walked over, looked. Her breath caught. The first image was a crude drawing of a figure in chains. A small girl, faceless, with heavy loops, binding her wrists to the floor. Behind her, stick figures stood with blank ovals for heads watching. Above them, a crude ceiling lamp. Below, the girl shadow. Eve flipped the page. The next image, a stairwell descending into darkness. Another small figure standing at the top. More shadows at the bottom. In the corner, a door without a handle. The last image, a face, if it could be called that. A blank oval again, but this time it wore a mask. No eyes. just slits. A long coat, long fingers. It stood next to a cot with chains at the foot of it. Georgia's fingers tightened on the sketchpad. These weren't dreams, these were memories. She looked up at the girl who now stared back, hollow and defiant, as if daring Georgia to pretend it was nothing. But Georgia didn't pretend. "I see you," she whispered. "I see all of it." And for a moment Eve's shoulders relaxed. Georgia stood up, walked to the front of the shop, and retrieved the broken shoe. She hadn't examined it closely before, not with real purpose. But now under the work light she noticed things. The stitching on the side hand-sewn but sloppily, like done in a hurry. The heel worn unevenly, almost sideways. And the sole. It was thin, not standard rubber. The texture was almost industrial. Cheap but not commercial. No logo. No tag. She set the shoe down and grabbed her coat. "Stay inside," she told Eve. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open for anyone." The girl didn't ask where she was going. She simply nodded. Georgia stepped out into the night. The French market at this hour was mostly closed, but a few stalls were still lit under tarps. The smell of fried food clung to the wet air. Georgia moved like she belonged there, but her eyes scanned sharply. She walked up to a stall run by a middle-aged man with a braided beard and hands stained with oil. His table was covered in second-hand boots, sandals, and everything in between. "Evening," she greeted. He nodded. "Cold one tonight. You looking for something real or just killing time?" Georgia pulled the shoe from her bag and set it gently on the table between them. "You seen this before?" The man picked it up, turned it in his hands, his brow furrowed. "Not regular stock, too narrow in the sole, not made for walking long." "Made for what then?" He looked up. "Institutional. Maybe shelters, maybe worse." Georgia didn't blink. "Where would one get shoes like this?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I've seen stuff like that come out of the lower Ninth. Big warehouse down by Claret Street. Folks say they do work contracts, cheap labor. No logos, no paper, just cash." Her heart clenched. "You saying kids work there?" The man shrugged. "I didn't say that. But if you look hard enough, you'll find things you don't want to see." Georgia stared at the shoe in his hand. She felt the memory of Melody's tiny baby feet, felt her voice saying, "Tighter, Mama. These laces are too loose." And now another child had been laced into this silent horror. She took the shoe back. Her voice when it came was steel. "I've seen things already." The man gave her a long look. "Then you know not to go near it. Some doors once open don't shut again." Georgia gave a short nod. "That's fine. I'm not looking to shut anything." When she got back to the store, Eve was sitting on the floor near the door, clutching her drawing pad like a lifeline. Georgia shut the door, locked it, and turned all the lights off except the small lamp above the counter. She set the shoe down next to the girl, knelt beside her, and whispered, "This came from hell, didn't it?" Eve nodded once. Georgia didn't press. She sat beside her, letting the darkness settle around them. Something inside her had shifted tonight. This wasn't just a lost girl. This was something more sinister, more deliberate. And if there was one thing Georgia Mason knew when darkness came for children, you didn't run from it. You followed it, and then you burned it down. The address scribbled on Georgia's receipt crumpled in her palm. As she stood across the street from the building the man had pointed her toward. It didn't look like hell, not at first glance. It looked like every other forgotten corner of New Orleans, the kind people walked past without thinking twice. A half-boarded warehouse with grime-painted windows, rust trailing like veins down the siding, and a crooked metal awning that creaked with every breath of wind. But it was wrong. The light was wrong. The silence was wrong. The smell, faint, sour, metallic, was very wrong. She stayed in the shadow of a closed produce stall, one hand in her coat pocket, wrapped around her cell phone, the other tight on the shoulder strap of her leather bag. The street was almost empty at this hour. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the orange glow of a flickering street lamp made everything feel unreal, like a stage set built for something terrible. She waited. Minutes passed, and then they came. A van rolled up silently, white, unmarked, no plates visible. The side door slid open, and a man in a black poncho stepped out. His movements were brisk, professional. From the back of the van, 2 children emerged, maybe 7, maybe 10. Georgia felt her breath hitch. One of them stumbled slightly and was pulled upright by a sharp tug on the arm. They didn't speak. The man led them toward the warehouse side door. He didn't knock. He keyed in a code on a barely visible pad. The door clicked open and the children were swallowed inside. Gone. No hesitation, no greeting, no goodbye. Georgia clenched her fists, nails digging into the heel of her palm. Every bone in her body screamed to move, to stop it, to do something, but she held still, breath shallow. Another 10 minutes. Another child. This time a small boy led by a woman in a coat too long for her frame. Her face was obscured, but Georgia saw it. The shimmer of plastic. A mask. Not theatrical, not decorative. Functional. Intentional. White, blank, with thin vertical slits for the eyes and mouth. She didn't speak, just guided the boy forward. He walked like he'd done this before. Georgia's stomach twisted. The woman tapped a different code. The door opened. They vanished inside. Georgia stumbled backward, ducking behind the produce stall again. Her hands were shaking. She reached for her phone but stopped short. What would she say? Who would believe a 70-year-old woman spying on a warehouse with ghost children and masked handlers? She turned, took one last look at the warehouse, memorized every crack in its siding, then walked quickly into the night, fighting the rising panic in her chest. Back in the shop, Eve sat where she'd been left, her arms wrapped around her legs, sketchpad on the floor beside her. She didn't look up when Georgia entered, but her body tensed. Georgia locked the door behind her, then leaned heavily against it. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Georgia crossed the room, sat beside her, and said quietly, "It's real, isn't it?" Eve's hands twitched. Her fingers reached for the notepad and began to scribble quickly. When she turned it, there was just one word. "Eve." Georgia blinked. "That's you." The girl nodded, once solemn and deliberate. Georgia didn't ask anything more. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say it'll be all right, because it wouldn't be. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, she stood, walked to the back of the shop, and stared at the narrow door she hadn't opened in 20 years. The storeroom. Once upon a time, it had been Melody's bedroom. Converted from an old storage space when the girl turned 13 and insisted she wanted her own world away from the squeaky bed upstairs. Georgia had painted the walls blue, hung string lights, even let her pick the curtains. After Melody disappeared, Georgia had locked the door and never gone back in. She couldn't bear to see it. Couldn't bear to scrub out the scent of shampoo, the faint chalk drawings on the wall. But tonight something else was stronger than the grief. Survival. She reached for the key above the doorframe, hand steady. The lock clicked open. Dust spilled into the hallway as the door creaked. The room inside was dark and stale, but exactly as she remembered. Posters on the walls, an old record player, a bookshelf of faded paperbacks, a stuffed bear slumped against the wall. Eve stood silently behind her, peering in. Georgia looked at her, then stepped aside. "It's yours now," she said. Eve entered cautiously, like stepping into someone's memory. Her fingers traced the bookshelf, the edge of the small desk. She didn't smile, but she didn't look afraid either. Georgia brought in a blanket, new sheets, a tray with tea and crackers. She added a nightlight. Then she pulled the door almost shut, leaving it open just enough for light to spill in. As she turned to leave, Eve tugged her sleeve, handed her the notepad again. She had written 3 words. "Don't let them." Georgia's throat closed. "I won't," she whispered. "I swear to you." She stepped out and gently closed the door. And just like that, the silent tunnel opened beneath her feet. Not made of stone, not underground, but woven through memory, pain, and the unbearable truth. Someone was taking children, and someone had once taken hers. Now she had a second chance, and she'd rather burn the world than lose it again. The next morning, Georgia woke before the sun, not because of habit, not because of age, but because there was no other choice. The weight of what she'd seen at the warehouse pressed on her chest like a stone in her lungs. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the masked woman leading the boy into the dark gnawed at her. And Eve sleeping in Melody's room like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. That image haunted Georgia even more. She stood in the quiet kitchen, a cup of black chicory coffee in one hand, a yellow legal pad in the other. Her pen scratched slowly across the page. Time of van arrival. 9:12 p.m. Code entered 4 digits. Hand-blocked view. 2 children. Boy approx. 10 girl approx. 6. White van unmarked. Driver male, late 30s, black poncho. Masked woman appeared 12 minutes later. Led small boy in alone. She flipped the page. Then carefully, she clipped 3 of Eve's drawings to the notes: the chained girl, the mask, the windowless stairwell. The last sketch Eve had made the night before was taped just beneath a crude iron bed with wrist straps drawn in red crayon. On the bed, a faceless doll with no eyes. Georgia stared at it for a long time. The drawing was jagged, desperate lines pressed into the paper so hard they left indentations on the table below. And yet it was precise. This was not fantasy. This was documentation from a child who had lived it. Georgia tucked the notes and drawings into a brown folder and walked into the front of the shop. The old analog security monitor blinked at her from above the register. For decades it had been nothing but routine. She reached up, clicked the dial backward, then forward again. Nothing. The screen remained black. She opened the cabinet beneath the monitor. The power light on the DVR unit was off. That wasn't right. She crouched and pulled the unit out. The wires in the back had been yanked, not unplugged. Yanked. A sharp pang sliced through her chest. Someone had been inside. Someone had known. She turned toward the front windows. The morning light was barely seeping through the slats, but she walked over anyway, pulled the curtain aside and stared out. Across the street, the antique bookstore's front door was ajar. A flicker of movement, a shadow quick and bird-like, disappeared behind the glass. Georgia didn't hesitate. She locked the front door, drew the inner blinds, and went straight to the back room. Eve sat curled on the mattress in Melody's room, still in oversized clothes, holding the eyeless doll from her sketch. Where she found it, Georgia didn't know. "Someone's been watching us," she said softly. "We need help. Real help." Eve didn't look afraid. She looked tired. She handed Georgia the sketch pad again and pointed to a page near the back. This time she'd drawn something new. A face. The mask again, but this one had a scar on the side, a small tear in the plastic just above where the cheek would be. Below it, the words, "She knows where I live." It took Georgia 20 minutes to work up the courage to make the call. Carl Dubois hadn't heard from her in almost 8 years. Not since Melody's case had finally gone cold for the last time, buried under years of false leads and disinterested detectives. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly the same, dry, blunt, with just a hint of old Southern courtesy. "Carl Dubois." "It's Georgia Mason," she said. A beat of silence. "Then, Georgia, is everything all right?" "No, it's not." She didn't go into detail over the phone, just gave him an address, a time, and said, "Come alone. And bring your spine." He laughed once. "Still don't mince words, do you?" "I don't have time to mince anything," she said, and hung up. They met in the back of a shuttered bakery 2 blocks from the shop, near a stained glass church Eve had pointed at on one of their walks. The bakery's owner owed Georgia a favor and still kept the spare key under the broken pot out front. Carl looked older than she remembered. Thinner, eyes a little more sunken. The kind of man who had fought too many battles and was still collecting bruises. His briefcase was scratched, shoes muddy, but his handshake was firm. "What's this about?" he asked. Georgia sat at the counter folder in front of her. "I think I found her." Carl frowned. "Melody." She shook her head. Not Melody, but something tied to her, something worse. She opened the folder and laid out the sketches, the notes, the broken security cable. He read in silence. When he got to the page with the faceless doll and the metal bed, he closed the folder slowly and looked up. "This is a child trafficking case." "I know. You have a witness." Georgia hesitated. She can't speak, but she can draw, and she's been there. Carl folded his hands, tapping his fingers. "We need evidence, not just pictures, not just testimony. Physical proof, faces, license plates, GPS coordinates. We need something they can't bury." Georgia nodded. "I'll get it." He studied her for a long time. "This could get dangerous, Georgia. These people don't operate in the light. You remember what happened in Baton Rouge last year?" "I do. They buried that teacher's investigation under a fire code violation, raided his home, found nothing. He ended up in hospice 3 months later." Georgia stared back at him, steel in her eyes. "I buried my daughter 40 years ago. Or I buried what was left of her. Either way, I'm done being afraid of shadows." Carl sighed, rubbed his temples. "I'll help you. But you need to be careful. This isn't just a local ring. If they're masked, if they're using ghost properties and night transport, this is federal, maybe international." She leaned forward. "Then it's going to take someone like me to walk into their dark." That night, Georgia sat at the kitchen table and laid out her plan like she was preparing for war. She drew a crude map of the block around the warehouse. She circled possible vantage points, noted the streetlight coverage, calculated when the van had arrived how long it had stayed. She checked the sketchpad again. In one of Eve's older drawings, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A clock on the wall behind the mask woman, drawn at exactly 9:13. Not imagination, a timestamp. Eve wandered into the kitchen, silent as always, and sat beside her. Georgia looked at her, then held up a cheap flip phone. "You know how to take pictures?" Eve nodded. "Good. You're going to help me make sure the world sees what's hiding in the dark." For the first time, Eve's face didn't just look tired or wary. It looked ready for something dangerous, something necessary. And Georgia felt that old firelight inside her chest again, the fire she thought had died with Melody. But it hadn't. It had just been waiting, and now it was burning its way out. The sky was slate gray and low when Georgia stepped out of the shop that afternoon, a tight chill pinching the wind off the river. The storm from 2 nights ago had passed, but the street still held its memory, wet cobblestones, the faint scent of mildew rising from the cracks. She walked with a determined rhythm coat, buttoned high, her purse clutched tight to her side. Inside the lining of that coat, sewn just behind the top button, was a tiny pinhole camera. Carl had given it to her that morning, along with instructions as precise as a soldier's. "You get 10 hours. It loops after that. Keep it dry. Keep it centered. Don't touch the lens," he had said, pressing the small square device into her palm like it was a relic from a forgotten war. "And Georgia, if they get wise, don't be a hero. Get out." "I haven't been a hero a single day of my life," she'd replied. "I'm not about to start now." Now she stood a block from the warehouse, watching it from the mouth of an alley. The white van was back. Same make, no plates, no markings. Parked at the same crooked angle near the rusted loading bay. Georgia adjusted her scarf, letting the camera catch the shape of the alley, the van, the building. Then she stepped into the open heading toward the rear entrance, where she'd noticed a makeshift junk stall last time, tables covered with old microwaves, rusted radios, half-broken sneakers, dusty kitchenware. The kind of setup that screamed legit but served a darker function behind the curtain. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at the children. She just let it run. A tall man with a cigarette hanging from his mouth met her at the edge of the stall. His eyes slid over her like she was nothing. "We don't usually get customers this early." Georgia smiled the way old women in the South are trained to smile, warm, disarming, with just enough steel to keep men from thinking she was blind. "I'm looking for a crock pot," she said. "My daughter burned mine to hell trying to make gumbo." The man squinted. "Ain't got no crock pots." She laughed lightly. "Well, then maybe something else. These old boots, what size are they?" She leaned in closer, giving the lens a view of the table, the stall, the building behind. Movement caught her eye. Behind the booth, through a half-open rolling door, she saw the hallway again, dimly lit. A concrete floor stained dark in the center. 2 men led a girl and a boy down it, small, underfed. The boy's face was pale. The girl's legs shook as she walked. Georgia's heart slammed once hard. She didn't flinch. Didn't move, just reached into her purse, pretending to look for her wallet. The camera caught it all. "Prices must have gone up since I last came here," she muttered. The man grunted. "Inflation." Another figure moved behind the children. Her. The woman with the mask. White plastic, no features, slits for eyes, that same long coat. Georgia froze, just for a second. The woman turned her head, sensing something. Georgia smiled again, wide and slow, and let out a dry laugh. "Damn shame none of this is good enough for a Christmas gift." The woman stared. Not long, just a flicker, then turned back toward the building. Georgia backed away, calm, unhurried. Her legs wanted to sprint, her breath wanted to fail. She turned the corner, ducked into the alley, then stumbled forward, and collapsed to her knees just as a shadow detached itself from the wall behind her. "Ma'am," a voice called. Male, alert, too close. She clutched her chest. "Oh, God," she gasped. "Heart pressure, sugar, oh, God." Strong arms caught her. The voice swore under his breath. "Somebody call, hey, ma'am, breathe, stay with me." She let her eyelids flutter, her breath tremble. "Need. Store," she murmured. "Down. The street." "Jesus," the man muttered, fumbling with his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No." Her voice was sharp enough to stop him. She gripped his jacket. No cops, no noise. He hesitated, looked around. Then, muttering something about old people and lawsuits, he helped her up. Georgia leaned into him, letting her body sag, every muscle screaming with restraint. He walked her halfway back to her shop before she waved him off. "I'm fine," she said, "just low blood sugar. Bless you, son." He nodded, awkward and relieved. "Take care of yourself." She entered the shop and locked the door behind her with shaking fingers. Inside, Carl was waiting. He rose from the counter the second he saw her face. "You got it?" he asked. Georgia pulled the camera from her coat, placed it on the counter like an offering, and collapsed into the nearest chair. "Just watch it," she said. Carl connected it to his laptop. The footage loaded, grainy but clear. The warehouse, the van, the masked woman, the children. He watched, jaw tightening with every frame. Then the shot of the hallway, the shadowed figures of children being led inside. Then the mask. He paused it, rewound, froze the frame, zoomed in. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "This is real." Georgia nodded. "I told you." He didn't respond. His fingers danced over the keys, saving the file, duplicating it, encrypting it twice. "Where are you sending it?" she asked. "CNN," he said. Off the record. Then the Southern Anti-Trafficking Coalition. They've been building cases like this for years. If this footage hits their radar, it won't just stay local. And the cops. He hesitated. "I'm not sure which ones we can trust yet." They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the city kept moving. A truck rumbled past. A woman laughed down the street. Somewhere, a trumpet played a single wandering note. Then, a noise, not outside. From the back room, Carl turned. Georgia stood. Eve. She stood in the hallway, silent, barefoot, her small hands clenched at her sides, her eyes locked on Georgia. Then suddenly, without hesitation, she ran. Not away. Toward. She threw her arms around Georgia's waist and held her like the world had fallen. Georgia froze. She felt the girl's body shake against hers, not with fear, but with something deeper, relief, grief, something that had no language. Then she heard it. A whisper, so faint it almost wasn't there. But it was. "Mm-mm." The sound caught like a note being pulled through broken glass. Then again, this time clear. "Mama." Georgia's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, pulling Eve into her lap, arms wrapped tight. Not melody, she knew that. But something in that voice, raw and fractured and desperate, cut through the scar tissue of 40 years. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and hot. She didn't correct the girl, didn't explain. She just rocked her, held her, and whispered back, "I've got you, baby, I've got you now." The story didn't go quiet. It exploded. By the end of the next day, George's shoe shop was no longer just a dusty corner of the French Quarter. It was on every screen in the state, every phone, every news banner, every radio broadcast that still carried local voices. Shoe store uncovers underground trafficking ring in the heart of New Orleans. 70-year-old woman exposes shadowy human trafficking operation. One camera, one storefront, one mute child, and a deadly secret. Carl had moved fast, too fast for the rot to bury itself again. He'd sent the footage to the Southern Anti-Trafficking Coalition at 3 a.m. They responded before sunrise. By 7 a.m., local news anchors were knocking on Georgia's locked front door. By noon, reporters were camped across the street, whispering into mics while holding up her shop as a symbol. A battleground, a miracle, a mystery. But inside, the truth hadn't quite caught up. Georgia sat in Melody's old room, Eve's room now. The air was thick with the past. She'd lit an old candle on the windowsill, one that still smelled faintly of lilac and dust, and she hadn't said a word in hours. The DNA kit lay open on the floor beside her. Carl had handed it to her gently that morning, his eyes searching hers for permission she wasn't sure she could give. "We can swab her cheek," he'd said, "or her hair. It's non-invasive. But if we don't know who she is, the state will try to claim her. Once this gets bigger, they'll want control. If there's a blood tie, Georgia, it changes everything." She had nodded once, and then she'd waited until Eve had fallen asleep that night, her body curled beneath Melody's old quilt, clutching that eyeless doll like a truth only she understood. Georgia hadn't needed to swab her cheek. She found a loose strand of hair caught in the brush, blonde but darkening, just like Melody's had at that age. She sealed it in the tube, labeled it in Carl's handwriting. Now she waited. She waited while the world outside called her brave and brave again. They didn't know the truth. Brave wasn't the word for what this was. This was grief reanimated, guilt repurposed. She stared at the wall, at the faded drawings Melody had made when she was 13. A horse, a cloud, a girl with one eye bigger than the other. Georgia had never repainted, never erased it. She told herself it was preservation, but deep down she'd known it was punishment. If you are hers, Georgia whispered to the candlelight voice cracking, then by God I swear I won't let them take you too. Her eyes burned, but the tears didn't fall. Not yet. Not until she knew. The results came back on a Wednesday. Carl showed up with the envelope clutched like a legal bomb, his eyes unreadable. Georgia opened the door before he knocked. She didn't ask if it was in there, didn't ask what it said. She just opened the envelope with hands that didn't tremble. Not this time. Carl waited in silence. The document was clinical. 2 pages. Language stripped of poetry. But one line caught her eye, bolded in black. Probability of relationship 99.9987%. Grandparent-grandchild. Georgia blinked. For a second she didn't breathe. Then she reread it. Again. Eve is Melody's daughter, Carl said quietly. There's no doubt. Georgia's knees buckled before she realized she was falling. She sank into the chair by the door, the document still in her lap, but her eyes no longer reading. She had a child, she murmured. Carl nodded. Probably not long after she went missing. Which means, she was alive! Georgia finished, her voice cracking wide open. For years. Carl moved to her, knelt beside the chair. We don't know the full story yet, but this girl, she didn't come from nowhere. And if that warehouse was connected to where Melody ended up, Georgia looked up at him. And finally the tears came, but they didn't come softly. They ripped through her loud and raw and guttural. Decades of silence, of waiting, of praying into a void. The hope she'd tried to kill with whiskey and sleep and denial. The long nights she'd sat on the porch whispering Melody's name into the wind. It all poured out of her like blood from an old wound that had never really closed. Carl didn't speak, just placed a hand on her shoulder and waited. When her sobs finally began to slow, Georgia clutched the DNA report like it was both a miracle and a sentence. She had a daughter, she said again, softer this time. And I wasn't there. I wasn't there for either of them. Carl's voice was quiet. But you are now. She shook her head. Too late. Too much damage. You saw what they did to her. You saw how she looks at the door when someone knocks. Carl squeezed her shoulder gently. That's not on you. Georgia looked toward the hallway, toward the little girl who still hadn't spoken again since that one word, Mama. Maybe she knew, maybe she didn't, but the truth was in her blood. And Georgia knew deep in her marrow that the reckoning wasn't over. This wasn't just about Eve. This was about what had been taken, and who had let it happen. She stood slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, the report clutched in her other. I need to talk to her. Carl opened the door. Georgia stepped into the hallway. Eve sat at the end of it, knees pulled to her chest, the eyeless doll clutched tightly in her arms. When she saw Georgia, she stood but didn't move. Georgia walked slowly toward her, then knelt, ignoring the ache in her joints. She held up the paper. This says you're my granddaughter. Eve's face didn't change, but her breathing hitched. Georgia set the paper down beside her, then reached out carefully and took the girl's hand. I didn't know. I swear to you, baby. I didn't know she was alive. I didn't know they took her like that. Eve's lips parted just slightly. She blinked once, twice. I lost her once, Georgia said, voice thick. I won't lose you too. I won't. And then slowly Eve stepped forward, wrapped her thin arms around Georgia's neck. Didn't speak, didn't cry, just held on. And this time Georgia held back with everything she had, not just as a guardian, not just as a savior, but as blood, as a grandmother, as the last remaining piece of a daughter stolen too soon. She buried her face in Eve's shoulder and wept again, not from guilt this time, but from the terrifying, fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, love could still find its way through the wreckage. Carl's voice was quiet, almost careful as he slid the folder across Georgia's kitchen table. It was late, nearly midnight. but the city felt suspended outside, hushed by something more than just darkness. Georgia didn't reach for the folder immediately. Her fingers were wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the steam long gone. She stared at it like it held more answers than the papers ever could. "You're sure?" she finally asked. Carl nodded once. I triple-checked it myself. She opened the folder. Inside, 2 birth certificates, one real, one doctored. A police report with ink that didn't match. An internal memo from the Missing Persons Bureau in 1984. A sealed note with initials that made Georgia's stomach turn. She read the name at the bottom. Edgar Mason, her ex-husband. Carl leaned back, exhausted. He paid a clerk in the records office. Just enough to misfile Melody's case. Enough to shift the focus. Kill the trail, bury her story. Georgia said nothing. The note says he believed she was beyond saving. That if they dragged the investigation further, it would bring shame, attention, danger. He said it was better to grieve and move on. She closed the folder. Her hands didn't shake. Her mouth didn't move. But inside, something vast and cold opened like a cellar door. The next day, Georgia walked into Magnolia Hills nursing home for the first time in over a decade. It smelled like antiseptic and waiting. Linoleum floors, beige walls, a soft piano loop repeating the same melody near the reception. She signed in under her own name. She didn't bother to hide. Room 3B was tucked in the east wing past rows of wheelchairs and windows full of potted plants long dead. Edgar Mason sat in a recliner facing the television where a muted talk show flashed headlines he didn't seem to follow. He was thinner than she remembered the thick-boned man from their younger years, now shrunken into his sweater like it might eat him alive. He didn't look up when she entered. "You were always good at disappearing," Georgia said, voice low and sharp. "I just never realized you did it while still breathing." He blinked slowly, then turned. Recognition hit him like dust in the throat. "Georgia." She stayed near the door. "You know why I'm here." He looked away. "I thought you'd be angry." "I'm past angry," she said. "I'm what comes after." Edgar sighed. His hands rested on the chair's arms like he didn't trust them to stay still. "I was afraid," he murmured. "We were being watched. I felt it. I still don't know by who. But Melody. After she vanished, there were calls. Letters slipped under the door. And then there was that woman." Georgia's heart clenched. "What woman?" "She came to the hospital during Melody's pregnancy. Said she was a nurse. Said they were transferring her for complications. No records. Just gone." Georgia stepped forward, her voice turning sharp. "And you just let her go. Let them take our daughter and never said a word." Edgar looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "I thought I was protecting us. You. They said if I made noise, they'd make Melody disappear for real. They made me sign something. I didn't know what to do." "You should have fought," she hissed. "You should have burned the whole city down if you had to." He slumped. "I chose silence. I chose to survive." Georgia's voice cracked. "And I died screaming into my pillow every night for 40 years because of that choice." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the walls themselves were ashamed. She stepped closer, stared down at the man who once wore a sheriff's badge and carried a revolver with swagger. "You were a coward," she said, "and your silence killed her." Edgar's lip quivered. "I didn't know she'd lived. I swear to God, Georgia, I didn't know about the baby. I thought—" "You didn't think she spat. You hid." He tried to reach for her hand. She stepped back. "Don't," she whispered. "You already let go once." And then she turned and walked out of the room, her spine straight, her steps loud against the linoleum. She didn't cry. Not there. Not for him. Later that evening, the city shook. A joint task force raid descended on the warehouse Georgia had filmed, but it didn't stop there. Using data from the Trafficking Coalition and Carl's submitted intel, law enforcement had tracked financial routes, property leases, surveillance footage, and more. And then they found it. A tunnel, hidden beneath the warehouse. No one had known it was there, not officially. But Eve's sketches had been accurate down to the slanted ceiling and rusted stairs. It was deep. Cold. Built decades ago. Perhaps part of the prohibition routes, perhaps not. But now it was cells. Dozens of them. Inside they found 19 children. Some barely able to walk, others too afraid to speak. Several were nonverbal. All were scarred physically or emotionally or both. They were pulled out one by one into the flashing lights of police vehicles, ambulances, journalists, snapping photos like it was spectacle, not rescue. Georgia watched it from her shop, the footage blurry but unmistakable. And then, there she was, the woman, dragged in cuffs, mask off now, face pale, lined with age, eyes dark and expressionless. Georgia's breath stopped. She knew that face, not from the warehouse, not from the footage, from before, from then. She was the nurse, the one who came to the hospital during Melody's delivery, the one who wheeled the empty bassinet away, the one Georgia had asked about twice only to be told there had been a transfer, that she was mistaken, that records were missing. She gripped the counter until her knuckles whitened. Eve stood beside her watching quietly. She didn't need to be told who that woman was. Georgia crouched, taking her hand. "That's the one, isn't it?" Eve nodded. Georgia stood slowly, rage and grief swirling inside her like a tornado refusing to land. She picked up the phone, called Carl. Get me everything she said. Every case this woman touched, every child she handled, every lie she helped write. Carl didn't ask questions. He knew the tone. It was the sound of justice sharpening its teeth. It should have been over. The cameras had already begun to roll back the press conferences, drafted the headlines typed in advance. Warehouse raid, freeze 19. Mask woman in custody. Hero grandma exposes underground ring. It should have been over, but in stories like this, the rot never goes quietly. The woman escaped. No one knew exactly how. One moment she was in cuffs flanked by officers outside the warehouse. The next, chaos. A fire alarm went off near the mobile command post. A backup generator failed. A miscommunication led to a moment, just one, of confusion. And she was gone. She vanished into the same shadows she'd walked children through for years. Back at the shoe shop, Eve had felt it before the call even came. She stood in front of the counter, her hand clutching the eyeless doll. Her eyes locked on the door like the ghosts outside had started moving again. Carl's voice over the phone was taut, panicked. "She's gone. Georgia, the woman. She slipped out during transfer. We don't know where." Georgia didn't blink. Eve tugged her sleeve. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She ran to the back room, grabbed her sketch pad, and returned moments later, already drawing. Her hands were fast, frantic. She flipped the page and shoved the pad toward Georgia. A stairwell, crumbling, a grate overhead, a vent with rusted teeth, and beside it a narrow tunnel almost hidden by shadows. A memory, a way out. Georgia stared at it. "She's heading underground," she whispered. "She's using the old system." Carl was still on the phone. What system? Georgia's voice dropped low. "There's a second tunnel. It was sealed in the 60s. It runs under the quarter from the old canning plant to the sugar refinery ruins. Melody once mentioned it. She and her friends used to dare each other to peek through the cracks." Carl was already moving. "Text me coordinates. I'll reroute the search." Georgia turned to Eve, who had drawn another page. This time it was clearer, more detailed. The entrance hidden beneath a broken statue in the cemetery, then a long descent. Arrows pointed to side tunnels. A red X where Eve stopped drawing. That was as far as she'd ever gone. Georgia tapped the page. "She's headed there." Eve nodded once, trembling. Georgia grabbed her coat. The cemetery was almost beautiful in the wrong kind of way. Low fog drifted between the tombs, curling around stone angels and rusted iron gates. The air smelled of wet earth and memory. Somewhere in the distance, the horn of a barge groaned on the river. Georgia led the officers past the mausoleums until she found the statue, an old Confederate monument half collapsed from storms and years of quiet protest. At its base, a hatch rusted over but still hinged. It groaned when they pulled it open. Stale dead air hissed out. Carl arrived seconds later, flashlight in hand, voice breathless. "Jesus," he muttered, peering into the dark. "She's really down there." Georgia didn't hesitate. She went in first. The descent was slow, slick with mildew. The flashlight beams bounced off rusted pipes, water-streaked walls, and the occasional scrawl of graffiti from kids who'd dared to play here decades ago. But deeper in there were no drawings, no jokes, just silence. And then shoes, not on feet, lined along the wall. Small shoes, old, new, torn, dozens of them. Georgia knelt beside a pair of pink canvas sneakers with cartoon strawberries faded from sun and wear. She reached out and touched them like they were bones. Carl crouched beside her. These kids. Georgia pointed toward the wall. Words were etched into the stone, carved with nails or glass or whatever children could find. Lena, 2015. Nico, still here. Don't forget me. Georgia swallowed the scream building in her chest. Further down the corridor, something shifted. Bootsteps, then silence. The team of officers raised their lights, weapons drawn. They rounded the corner. There she was, the woman, no mask now. Just her pale, worn face streaked with sweat and blood, her coat trailing mud. She stood at the end of the tunnel like a painting in wrought. No panic in her eyes, no shame, just a stillness, a knowing. Georgia stepped forward before anyone else. The woman looked at her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're persistent," she said, her voice dry as bone. Georgia didn't smile back. "Where's Melody?" The woman's lips curled. Gone, like the rest. Georgia took another step. "You were her nurse." "I was a lot of things," she said, "none of them yours." Carl moved closer, his voice sharp. "Put your hands up." The woman didn't move. "I helped bring her into the world," she said, looking at Georgia again. She screamed like she knew what was waiting. "You don't forget a scream like that." Georgia's fists clenched. "You took her." "I saved her," the woman said flatly. "From you. From your small life. From becoming you. You buried her," Georgia spat. "And now you'll answer for every one of these names on the wall." The woman laughed once dry hollow. "No one answers. That's the secret. No one ever truly pays." Then she ran. It was fast, unexpected. Down the corridor, into the side tunnel, deeper into the dark. But this time she didn't disappear. Georgia chased. Carl behind her, the officers too. They caught her at the iron door Eve had drawn in red. She was fumbling with a chain when they tackled her to the ground. Cuffs clicked. She didn't fight, didn't scream, just stared at the wall beside her where a single name was etched in uneven strokes. Melody G. Carl saw it, so did Georgia. And for a moment no one spoke. The woman looked up at her captors with eyes like dry wells. "You'll build your headlines," she said. "You'll make your arrests. But you'll never dig deep enough. You're scratching rot with a sewing needle." Georgia leaned in her voice like crushed glass. "And yet I found you." That was the last thing she said. The media didn't need to be told this time. The story caught fire. News helicopters circled the cemetery. SWAT vans cordoned off entire blocks. Drones flew overhead, capturing footage of the hatch, the tunnels, the evidence. Families across the state started calling the hotline, wondering if the shoes in the photos belonged to children they'd lost years ago. Carl stood before the press that evening, hair wet from rain tie, pulled loose, exhaustion clinging to his bones. "We have reason to believe this tunnel network was operational for at least 25 years, he said. "Possibly longer. It's part of a broader trafficking ring that spanned multiple states. And yes, we are just beginning." The crowd of journalists buzzed like flies. Who ran it? How high did it go? Were authorities involved? Carl didn't flinch. "We'll find out." Back in the shop, Georgia placed the pair of pink sneakers on a shelf near the window. Next to them, a note Eve had written in block letters. "They still matter." Georgia stood for a long time looking out at the quiet street, and for the first time in a very long time, she no longer saw shadows waiting to take something from her. She saw truth crawling back to the surface. Finally, mornings at the shop changed. Not in the way that made headlines, not in the way journalists would notice, but in the quiet, sacred way that real change always does. Eve began waking before Georgia. The first time it happened, Georgia stirred from the creak of the wooden floorboards and the faint sound of running water in the sink. She stepped out of her bedroom and found Eve in the back sleeves rolled up carefully, wiping down a row of shoes with a cloth nearly as big as her forearm. She was humming, barely audible but real. Georgia didn't say a word. She just leaned against the doorway and watched. It had been weeks since the arrest. The tunnels were sealed. The court cases were underway. The media had mostly moved on to newer scandals. But in this quiet little shop, things were still shifting slowly, gently, in ways only the soul could track. Eve hadn't spoken since that one whisper, "Mama," but she'd begun to write. Every morning, Georgia found new words scribbled in chalk on the board near the register. Hope, again, safe, shoes, no stories. Georgia smiled at that one. She started teaching Eve how to shape her handwriting, how to hold the chalk between her fingers like a pencil. And Eve, in turn, began teaching Georgia how to be patient with silence. They became something that wasn't quite mother and daughter. Not quite grandmother and granddaughter, but something honest, something that didn't need a name. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of donated shoes, Eve pulled out a tiny pair of red Mary Janes and placed them on the bench beside her. She pointed at the frayed strap. "Think these are worth saving?" Georgia asked. Eve nodded, then picked up a brush and began scrubbing the edge with quiet concentration. Georgia sat beside her and tapped the toe of a faded boot in her lap. "You know your mama wore shoes just like those once," she said softly. "Not these exactly, but close." She scuffed them up, climbing a wrought iron fence behind the old St. Catherine's Church. Tore the buckle right off. Eve looked up, eyes wide. Georgia smiled, tears pricking her throat. She wanted to fly, that girl. Wanted to be an astronaut one week, a drummer the next. She'd come home with her knees scraped up and say, "I'm collecting stories, Mama. Every scar's a story." Eve didn't look away, so Georgia kept talking, and that's how it began. Day after day, shoe after shoe, Georgia told the stories. Not just of Melody, but of the shop, the neighborhood, the way the sidewalks used to flood with laughter when the jazz boys played. She told Eve about the man who'd proposed in a pair of hiking boots, the woman who'd walked out of her divorce in 6-inch heels, the child who danced until his sneakers tore apart at the seams. "Shoes hold soul," she said once. "They remember where we've been even when we try to forget." Eve picked up a pen and wrote on a blank tag, "These shoes saw a brave thing." They hung the tag over the red Mary Janes and placed them on the display shelf. The back storage room, once a graveyard of forgotten souls, became something new. With Carl's help and a quiet grant from the Anti-Trafficking Coalition, Georgia turned it into a reading room, a safe space. A place with cushions and shelves and windows that let the sun fall in soft ribbons across the floor. They called it the Quiet Corner. It was open by invitation only. No signs, no fanfare. Just a warm door and a nod to the right people. By the end of the month, 3 other children had come through, each one carrying scars invisible to the world, but screaming just under the skin. Georgia didn't pry. She offered them shoes, snacks, books, and quiet. Sometimes that was all it took. Sometimes it wasn't enough, but it was a start. Carl came by twice a week now, sometimes in a suit, sometimes in rolled-up sleeves, laptop under one arm, and exhaustion in his eyes. "I've got a backlog of reports taller than me," he said one evening, sipping her bitter coffee. "Tips coming in from 6 states, all anonymous, all credible, all naming people I never thought I'd see on a list like this." He looked at Georgia over the rim of the mug. "You crack something open, you know." Georgia shrugged. Felt more like tearing something down. Carl shook his head. "It wasn't just that. It was you. You gave them permission to believe this kind of evil could be caught, that it wasn't just whispers in alleyways." Georgia chuckled dry and low. "I'm just a woman with polish under her nails and 30 years of bad knees." Carl pulled a small envelope from his satchel. She frowned. "What's that?" He slid it toward her. Inside was a formal letter, thick paper gold trim. "In recognition of extraordinary civilian contribution to justice and child protection." Georgia rolled her eyes. "Good Lord." Carl smirked. "The city council's giving you a medal. You should at least pretend to care." She set the letter down. "I do care," she said. "Just not about medals. You can't pin closure to a chest." Carl's smile softened. "Then what do you care about?" Georgia looked toward the back where Eve was curled up in the corner with a pencil and a sketch pad. She didn't answer right away. Then finally, "I care that she sleeps now. I care that she laughs when she draws shoes with wings. I care that she chose to stay." She looked back at Carl. "I care that I lost my daughter once, and somehow through fire and ash and ruin I found myself again. Through hers." Carl nodded quiet. They didn't speak for a while after that. Some things didn't need to be said. The next morning, Georgia opened the shop a few minutes early. Eve was already up, already brushing the storefront glass with vinegar water and humming something tuneless but sweet. Georgia flipped the closed sign to open, then stepped out onto the street. A few people waved from across the square. Strangers mostly. But some were familiar faces, neighbors who'd once looked past her store like it didn't exist. Now they nodded with quiet respect. She walked back in and found a note on the counter. In Eve's handwriting, carefully shaped and spelled, "Some shoes get lost. Some shoes come home." Georgia smiled, pressed the note to her chest. Then she picked up a pair of polished brown loafers, handed them to Eve, and said, "Time to give these a second chance." Eve took them gently. That's what they did now. They gave things second chances. Shoes, stories, people. The broken didn't stay broken here. Not anymore. The mornings came softer now. No sirens, no headlines, no shadows lingering behind windows. Just the slow rhythm of the French Quarter, waking up distant horns from the River Café chairs scraping pavement, the occasional laugh breaking the silence like sun-cutting fog. The shoe shop opened at exactly 800 a.m., just like it used to. But something had changed, something you could feel before you even stepped inside. Above the door, just beneath the time-worn wooden sign that still read Georgia's Souls, a new hand-carved plaque had been added. Simple, subtle, a place to begin again for the children without names. The words weren't flashy. They didn't scream, but they carried weight. And for those who knew how to read the quiet language of survival, they meant everything. Inside, the scent of leather and polish still lingered, but it was now accompanied by something sweeter, like fresh paper crayons, warm milk, and cinnamon. The front counter was freshly painted, the floors waxed to a dull glow. In one corner sat a small bookshelf filled with journals and sketch pads. The back room remained the quiet corner, and in the center of it all, seated on her small wooden stool with her sleeves rolled up and her eyes focused, was Eve. She was no longer the silent girl curled in on herself. She moved with intention now, confidence. She dipped a soft bristle brush into a bowl of water and gently scrubbed the side of a child's sneaker. The sole was still intact, but the canvas bore streaks of mud, old and dry. Across from her, Georgia sat polishing a black leather loafer, her hands working with the same rhythm they always had, but now accompanied by quiet humming. She didn't direct, she didn't correct. She just worked alongside Eve as if they'd been doing this their whole lives. The shop bell above the door jingled softly as an elderly woman stepped inside, holding the hand of a boy no older than 6. His eyes were wide, his shoes were nearly falling apart. Georgia looked up and smiled. "You must be our 10 o'clock. The woman smiled back, but said nothing. The boy, hesitant, stared at the shelves, at the rows and rows of shoes waiting for a story. Eve stood and gently guided him to the bench near the window. She handed him a cloth. Then she sat beside him, picked up another shoe, and began to clean. The boy watched her, and then slowly he did the same. Georgia watched from the counter, heart warm. This was what the world never saw on camera. The after, the rebuilding, the part where children didn't need words to begin again. Later that afternoon, Georgia found Eve sitting at the table in the back room, her knees drawn up, a small hardcover journal open in front of her. Her handwriting had improved. Still uneven, still full of character, but legible now. Intentional. Eve closed the book when Georgia entered, but not before Georgia glimpsed the final line she'd just written. "I don't need to speak, I've been heard." Georgia didn't say anything, just walked over, placed a glass of lemonade beside her, and kissed the top of her head. Then she walked to the front of the shop. The sunlight cut through the blinds in golden slats, landing across a particular pair of shoes on the display shelf, small brown leather ones, barely worn, the soles still carrying the impression of a child's uncertain steps. Georgia climbed the small step stool and placed them on the highest shelf in the center, under the soft light. They were Eve's first shoes from the day she arrived, patched up and cleaned, but never soled, never touched again. They weren't for wearing anymore. They were for remembering, for honoring. She stepped down and stood for a long moment just looking at them. That was when she turned to the wall beside the register. The photo of Melody had always hung there, young, wild-eyed, grinning through her teenage years. But now beside it a new frame had been added. A black and white photo of Eve Chin resting on her hand, eyes clear, mouth quiet but present. Beside that a third photo, this one taken just last week. Georgia, Eve, and Melody's photo placed side by side in a handmade triptych. 3 generations. One bloodline fractured but not broken, scarred but not destroyed. 3 faces. One story. A woman who had lost everything. A daughter who had been stolen. A granddaughter who had survived. Together again, not in body, not entirely, but in soul. The wound hadn't vanished, but it had closed. Not with force, with love, with choice, with time. That evening, Georgia sat on the stoop out front, a cup of coffee in hand. Eve curled up beside her head, resting on her shoulder, the soft hum of the neighborhood filling the silence. The street lamps began to flicker on. A breeze swept past them, carrying the scent of river water, old brass, and magnolia. Eve pointed toward the sidewalk across the street, where a woman was walking with her son, holding hands, laughing about something no one else could hear. Georgia smiled. "They look happy," she said. Eve nodded, then pulled out her sketch pad and began to draw. Georgia looked down at the girl's work in progress. Just a simple sketch, 2 pairs of shoes walking side by side. No faces, no labels, just feet in motion. "What's it called?" Georgia asked. Eve hesitated, then wrote beneath it, "Forward." Georgia let out a soft breath, leaned back against the brick. "You know something, baby?" Eve looked up. "I think that's what we finally are." Eve raised an eyebrow. Georgia smiled, moving forward. And with that they sat in peace as the world shifted slowly around them, not with thunder but with footsteps, with breath, with hope that didn't need a parade to matter. Inside the shop the lights dimmed. The shelves stood quietly, filled with stories no one had ever told aloud. The sign above the door caught the final light of the day, a place to begin again for the children without names. And beneath it 2 shadows walked back inside side by side, carrying a pair of newly cleaned shoes, ready for their next story. Fade out, the sound of footsteps, and the warm, steady breath of a city finally remembering how to listen.